Hello, everybody. I'm Alonso Duralde, film reviews editor at TheWrap. We are delighted to have you here for our 2021 award screening of My Name is Pauli Murray, with directors Betsy West and Julie Cohen, producer Talleah McMahon, and editor Cinque Northern. We're going to be showing you the trailer, and then we'll go right into conversation with our panelists. If you are in the audience, please participate in the live chat on the stream. Share your thoughts about the film and let us know where you're tuning in from. Before we introduce the guests, let's take a look at the trailer.
There are some people who now argue that you cannot teach American history without teaching about Pauli Murray.
Pauli was a writer, a lawyer, a priest, a poet. Pauli was a feisty woman.
My name is Pauli Murray. My whole history has been a struggle in a society dominated by the ideas that blacks were inferior to whites and women were inferior to men.
Pauli was way ahead of the times.
I chose for my senior paper, should Plessy versus Ferguson be overruled? My little argument went to the Supreme Court.
Y'all see all of the different folks that are in this room? That is made possible by Pauli Murray.
If you rip away everything, oppression is the business of not respecting one's personhood. For my first 2 years, I was the only woman in the law school. They didn't even let me talk.
Thurgood Marshall is talking about Jim Crow, and she says, what I'm experiencing is Jane Crow.
Pauli Murray was not just an amazing lawyer or a badass feminist, but also a queer, non-binary person. Sitting in front of Murray's notes, the turmoil and the suffering, this is a feeling I know well. Scholars who have written about Pauli largely still use feminine pronouns. I don't know what pronouns Pauli would say.
Trans and gender non-binary people have always been a part of our American context. So did y'all just think that your generation invented it?
But if this country is to survive, we must live together in harmony.
Pauli may not have realized they would be a beacon for so many folks.
Pauli's time had not come. We have to work for a world in which it does come.
You say I can't, I'll show you I can, even if I die trying.
Welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce Betsy West, Julie Cohen, Talleah McMahon, and Cinque Northern. Welcome. Congratulations on the film, for one thing. It's really an extraordinary piece. I guess we should start with, let's start at the beginning. What brought this project into being? Obviously, it's of a piece with recent work that Julie and Betsy have been doing in terms of, great women of the 20th century. Although in this case, we're going to say assigned female at birth of the 20th century. But how did this project start?
Well, Alonso, as people who've seen the film know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg credited Pauli Murray with coming up with the strategy for winning equality for American women under the law. And so when Julie and I were making the film RBG, we learned about Pauli Murray, but didn't know much more than that. And then after the film, we did a little bit of Googling, and it didn't take long to uncover the life story of this extraordinary person. And, the first question we asked ourselves was, why have we never heard of Pauli Murray before this? Look at this life and these accomplishments. And then, possibly could we make a documentary?
Yeah, Pauli's story, frankly, for us felt a little bit mind-blowing. But it can feel pretty interesting and good to have one's mind blown, especially if it gets, that happens in such a way that it really opens your mind, not only to hearing and learning about this incredible biography, but how much else it says about 20th century history and even the reminder that our understanding of history, what we learned at school, is often so incredibly, just big chapters that probably should be there are missing. But it's never too late to learn them. And I think actually learning as an adult is sometimes a little bit more rewarding than in school.
Absolutely. So this is a story that it's kind of shocking that it has not gotten more traction, in the general conversation. Having dug this far into Pauli's life and exploring the impact that they had on 20th century American history, what do you think that is about? That anonymity, where does it come from?
I think it's really hard to say exactly why that is, but there are clearly a few factors. And one important one is that Pauli Murray was so ahead of the time that whenever there was a focus on an issue that Pauli had raised, Pauli had moved on to something else. And so by the time there was a movement, Pauli wasn't really at the center of it. And so in some ways, the people who are at the center of movements when change is really happening actively, those are the people who get the credit. And so Pauli unfortunately wasn't a part of that. And then also I think, part of Pauli not being a part of those movements has something to do, I think we, can say, with racism at the time and sexism and an anti-queer bias. And so it seems like all of those factors combine to create a situation where Pauli wasn't necessarily as recognized as Pauli should have been at the time.
True. I think certainly it took Bayard Rustin a while to kind of get the credit that he deserved as somebody who was such a prime mover behind, the March on Washington and so much of what MLK was doing. So, the fact that you have an AFAB, non-binary, Black person it's all the more challenge, I'd say, to bring them to the forefront of sort of historical record and credit. Now, Julie and Betsy, you are, of course, coming off of RBG, as you mentioned. You've got Julia out in theaters right now. And both of these are portraits of people who lived very public lives. For Julia, you obviously had a decade's worth, a treasure trove of television material to include in a documentary. And here you're working with very much the opposite circumstances. Not a ton of photographs, not a ton of footage. So going into this project, knowing that you were going to tell this story, what were your sort of initial ideas about how do we visually present this life in a film in a way that's going to be different from what the two films we've just come off of?
Well, I think that we really benefited from the fact that Pauli saved so much during a lifetime and made sure that it all went to an archive at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. And in fact, the first thing that we discovered, and Talleah went there early on in this whole process to start to sort through the 141 boxes of material. I mean, there were letters and diaries and also a lot of photographs. I mean, considering that Pauli Murray was living in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. Pauli kept a camera, took it along when riding the rails, had somebody take a photograph of Pauli climbing up on the back of a train. I mean, there were quite a number of photographs of Pauli, and even more important for documentary filmmakers, audio tapes of interviews that were done with Pauli over the years, mostly later on in life in 1970s when people interviewed Pauli about Pauli's role in the women's movement and also becoming the first female identified African-American Episcopal priest. People would come and interview Pauli, and Pauli would have the wherewithal and maybe the sense of Pauli's place in history to record all those interviews. So they were also left in the library. And then we did happen upon a couple of videos. One is a Charles Kuralt thing from CBS News having to do with Pauli as a priest. And then another one, a young woman had interviewed Pauli putting together a sort of feminist curriculum and dropped this tape off at the Schlesinger Library. Had never been digitized before we came upon it. And, that was a wonderful gift because I think the video of Pauli there, waiting to be interviewed and, reprimanding the dog and typing on the typewriter allowed us to show the personal side and the amazing smile of Pauli Murray. So, we benefited from Pauli's curation of a life.
Yeah, Pauli's voice is so clear in all of these dozens of hours of audio and a little bit of video that it seemed like it was going to be able to tell the story very strongly in Pauli's own words. The problem is that they were often just words that you were hearing. And I think, when Betsy and Talleah and I came to Cinque early in the sort of research and shooting and just get into the edit process, what we said was like, we don't want to shy away from using audio. And so, the kind of monumental challenge facing him was like, this story was not a podcast. This was a film. So how do we take these really piercing, often really strong words and, build that into a full visual cinematic film?
And obviously the fact that Pauli's a poet, I think, gives you a lot of license to take those lines of text and use them in interesting visual ways and ways that really are kind of underscoring the larger story that's being told. But yes, Cinque, if you can maybe just talk about, when you started, what material you were looking at, and as you kind of shaped this project along the way, was it an idea of finding things to fill in the gaps, or the opposite of sort of figuring out how to trim all the stuff that you had and deciding what would get prioritized?
Well, like I said, we had like we had riches in a wealth of audio, and it was telling the story. But sometimes in some scenes, while we had some amazing photos, images of Pauli Murray, those photos and images didn't always tell the story that Pauli was telling. And in some cases, there was no footage. So Pauli being arrested on the bus, there are no images of that, but yet right. We have a whole scene to create. So the approach became really like world building and creating an environment and a texture and feeling like you're in that space, so that when you do see Pauli's image, maybe for just a brief moment, you're not aware that you're not seeing a lot of images of Pauli. Kind of like the shark in Jaws. Like, we had to make the most of the moments, and that video of Pauli Murray with the smile and the dog, it really took us, we used every inch of it, and we really used it. That was more about you getting a sense of who Pauli was. There was plenty of dialogue to tell you what Pauli did, but to get that sense of who Pauli was as a person so you can connect and relate, that was all about like really maximizing that video and also the images, so you really felt like you were in a scene and in a moment.
Alonso, you mentioned the poetry, though. I think Cinque did an incredible job in editing the scenes of the poetry, which became a larger part of our documentary as the project went along, because we realized that Pauli's poems really helped to transition from some of these very difficult chapters of Pauli's life. So I just love the way Cinque took advantage of Pauli's words and poetry and found images to go with that.
Now, Betsy, you made a really great documentary called The Lavender Scare. And I think that it is part of a handful of films that deal with queer life before 1960. And I think there's always a challenge because so many people were living kind of occluded lives at that point that right. There's not a necessarily a historical record. It does come down to journals and letters and some photographs. And so I wonder if you could just address specifically the challenges of telling a story from the vantage point of the 21st century, talking about people who were having to keep a lock on, that aspect of themselves.
Yeah, well, director Josh Howard did a really smart thing when he read the book, The Lavender Scare, and then started working with Stephen Johnson, who had written that book. He immediately interviewed Frank Kameny And Frank Tammany, it was like the godfather of or the grandfather, I'm not sure how you would say it, of the gay rights movement. Somebody who just didn't take the Lavender Scare lying down. He was fired from a job in 1959, and as hundreds, thousands of gay people had been fired from their official jobs, and just went quietly into the night. And Frank was the first person to say, I'm going to take this on. I mean, it was a decades-long battle, that lasted up into the 1990s, in fact. But so the key was to get Frank on the record, which was really important. And as we've been talking here with Pauli Murray, to find the people who knew Pauli. Pauli wasn't here, but we had all these wonderful audio tapes. But we also wanted to get a sense of who Pauli was, and we're very lucky to be able to interview Pauli's grandniece, and also the students who, and also Pauli's somewhat contemporaries, Eleanor Holmes Norton and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who did a separate interview with us, and then the students at Brandeis, who did for us a very moving interview about their evolving relationship with Pauli, which started out in a kind of rocky way when they had a semantic battle over whether or not to use the word Black or use the word Negro. And yet it then evolved into this true friendship. And, sadly, one of those gentlemen has since passed away. So we do feel very lucky to have been able to capture those voices.
I just would want to add to that. I think it's important to note that one of the questions we were grappling with when we started working on this is, what would Pauli want people to know? As you mentioned, Pauli's not around to share, what Pauli would think now and how much Pauli would want people to understand, grappling with gender identity or sexuality or any of that. And so in the beginning, one of the questions was, well, Pauli wasn't really open about this. So what should we share, and how can we be responsible in telling Pauli's story without hiding any of that? Because, so much of that, it's like the times have changed, and so much of that was tied to shame and repercussion. And now we live in a new world where Pauli would be celebrated and embraced for all of, all of Pauli's identities. And so what we discovered reading through the archive is that what Pauli left for us to see was highly intentional. It was very clear that it was well curated by Pauli before Pauli passed away. And so I was particularly going through all the records, and I could see that Pauli had scratched out names and letters and diaries, and Pauli had ripped out pages from the diaries. And so everything that we were seeing was what Pauli wanted us to see. And so that's what really gave us the confidence to share that part of Pauli's life.
Well, and also the film, I think, talks to a lot of contemporary, trans political and intellectuals who have embraced Pauli as a role model and icon. And so I think y'all aren't telling tales out of school. This is what we learned in the film. I'm assuming, based on the people who come forward to talk about Pauli's importance, that is out there in the world, and folks have heard about it. It's also great that there was still somebody who was around, who was a witness to Pauli's relationship with the woman at the law firm that had lasted so many decades. Because yes, obviously that comes out in the letters and the photos and whatnot, but to have a witness still around, that's always, adds a lot, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your hopes for, Pauli's public perception when you began this project versus now that you're really being able to tell their story to the world? Is there a hope that if not the film itself, that Pauli becomes part of the curriculum?
I'd say absolutely. I think that's part of the excitement of a project like this. We were by no means discovering Pauli. In fact, all the four of us were maybe latecomers to the Pauli Murray story, and that even going back to Pauli's lifetime, for 4 decades ago, scholars, particularly Black women scholars, have been writing, journal articles, academic books, really deep studied history about this important figure. As academics are writing about all kinds of figures that we don't get to hear about in the history books, and perhaps it's a reminder we should, but I think kind of intentionally doing something for a popular audience in the form of documentary, which is like, we're not getting into all of this story by any means. There is so much, truthfully, about Pauli's life that's missing, and this is really just a beginning. But like, I think we're excited. I feel excited not only by people having seen the film, but even through the film being out there in the world, people starting to learn Pauli's name and Google for themselves. I mean, it's an interesting and kind of different project from any that I've worked on before, in that you're starting from a place of, where many of the audience are going to come with a blank slate.
For all that they don't discuss in the book, how did Pauli's memoir color into the structure of the story, whether the chronology or just in terms of what you focused on or what blanks you were trying to fill in? How did it serve as a roadmap for the project?
Well, it was a very important roadmap because we discovered an audio tape of Pauli reading a huge portion of the memoir for the benefit of a friend who was going blind, and Pauli wanted this friend to be able to hear the memoir. And so, we have the sections about Pauli's upbringing, childhood, the early struggles in New York, going to Hunter College, and on through the 1950s. Very helpful, Pauli reading this. I mean, what viewers may not realize when watching the film is that it's not just one narrative. I mean, you hear Pauli's voice narrating the story of being arrested for refusing to go to the back of the bus, but this is pieced together from a number of interviews that Pauli did, and using the memoir, and through Cinque's magic and also the magic of our audio technicians to be able to make this sound seamless, as if it really is being narrated by Pauli Murray.
This is a question for all four of you. In digging into this life and uncovering so many of the ways that Pauli was a pioneer in different fronts, what do you have a single moment that you think of as sort of the biggest surprise you encountered along the way?
I mean, Pauli's a hard one for that question because every single fact of Pauli's life felt pretty surprising and revelatory. I guess in my mind, the biggest surprise was seeing the letters that Pauli was writing to doctors as early as 1940, asking for the testosterone treatment. Or exploratory surgery at a time when there wasn't a word for transgender, when these this medical, this just wasn't, science wasn't ready for Pauli. Like Pauli's thinking was way ahead of where the popular science anyway was, and to see this very thoughtful but sadly desperate letter to me felt surprising, but also really sad.
No, I would kind of echo that around the letters to doctors, but also the letters to Aunt Pauline, who it was like pleasantly surprising to me, where the typical story of this kind of life is that you're ostracized from your family, where this is the total opposite. You have most of what we learned about Pauli Murray's gender issues and gender identity and self-definition around gender were letters written to Aunt Pauline, and that's who Pauli confided in. And so here is somebody who raised someone and was completely just allowing. And so it was when Pauli Murray entered the real world, the outside world, where the opposition came up. So that was kind of a pleasant surprise that there was that level of beyond acceptance. It was just Pauli was allowed to be who Pauli was. And I think that's a big part of Pauli Murray going out into the world and demanding demanding equity, really, across every space. So yeah, it was that.
Yeah, I would just echo that to say, I think for me, going into it, we knew that Pauli was such a private person while Pauli was alive. And so a lot of what Julie and Cinque have been talking about wasn't even known by Pauli's friends. Like most people that we interviewed had no frame of reference for this at all. And so it was a pleasant surprise to see that in the archives, Pauli went there. Pauli left all of these personal records. It wasn't just legal documents and speeches and things like that. It was actually, the diaries and the letters to Aunt Pauline and other things along those lines that really allowed us to get at Pauli in a personal way. And so that was exciting.
One thing that I learned in the course of doing this was that, yes, many people don't know about Pauli Murray, but definitely Pauli's name is rising, and especially with a younger generation. So I loved when we were at the Schlesinger Library, and I just, which is a library of some of the most consequential women in American history. When you're down there in the archives, it's really pretty impressive. And the archivist said to us that the Pauli Murray collection is now the most requested at the Schlesinger Library, which is, I think, an indication of the fact that a younger generation, especially in college and in classes, Pauli is beginning to be taught in colleges, and people are learning Pauli's name. So that was a surprise and a happy one.
Is there any sort of academic controversy about Pauli's participation? I mean, you guys, I think, lay out a pretty clear case that that Pauli's work in law school sort of creates a roadmap for getting rid of the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal and sort of changing the goalposts for Black equality in America, and that Thurgood Marshall doesn't give Pauli the credit due. Are there Thurgood Marshall scholars that are saying, well, no, that's not, how dare you, or is this becoming generally acknowledged that, yes, the history as being presented here is what went down?
Well, the history that Pauli wrote, the paper that Pauli wrote at Howard Law School in the mid-1940s is hard to deny, because Pauli helpfully left that paper in the archive, and one can see, if you compare the paper with the brief that the NAACP actually filed with the Supreme Court on Brown v. Board, you can see how some of Pauli's major ideas are in there. I do think Thurgood Marshall did a lot more than just arguing that one case before the Supreme Court, and an intellectual legal idea is one thing, developing a complicated, thought out, long-term legal strategy, as Marshall did, and then taking it to the Supreme Court with more than 30 cases and winning more than 30 cases. I think he was 32 for 34 or something like that. I mean, his achievements in legal racial equality are monumental and unparalleled, and certainly I don't think our film is trying to say otherwise. The interesting thing is that, intellectually, Pauli came up with that thought and was pushing for it at a time when kind of the heart of the legal civil rights movement just didn't have the kind of optimistic vision that Pauli had. They weren't saying, oh, what you're saying is wrong. They were saying it will never win. We're not going to be able to win to make the argument that separate but equal is inherently unjust. That's not going to be a winning argument. And Pauli was saying, no, but it's really right. So yes, that should be the argument. And that there's kind of no denying that Pauli was the correct one at that time.
You talked about doing a new interview with Justice Ginsburg for the film. Did she and Pauli know each other at all, or was it just they were? Oh,
yes. Pauli recommended Ruth Bader Ginsburg to join the ACLU board. And so wrote a letter of recommendation, and they were colleagues on that board and knew each other, in that role. And of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had read Pauli's earlier article about, suggesting that legal feminist lawyers turn toward the 14th Amendment as the key to fighting for equality. So yes, they knew each other. I wouldn't say they were close friends, but the fact that RBG put Pauli's name on the cover of the first legal brief that she wrote before the Supreme Court, even though Pauli didn't write that brief, but it was really a nod to Pauli and to Dorothy Kenyon, the co-author of that article that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had read. And she wanted to acknowledge them, which is, something that not everybody would do, but it's an indication of how she regarded Pauli's contributions.
This is strictly just kind of an award season question, just because that's part of why we're having this conversation right now. Julie and Betsy, you have 2 documentaries in contention this year, and I'm wondering if there was ever a thought, because of awards, to push one to another calendar year, just so you weren't in competition with yourselves.
Those are not our choices. Like these are films that have distributors and producing partners, and it was actually the schedule of COVID that changed things slightly. That originally they were intended for different years, but production schedules are what they are. So the films are out. We hope that they are both, and our main goal for both of them is for many people to watch them, enjoy them, be moved by them, and be impacted by them.
Talleah and Cinque, you are both filmmakers in your own right. You have you've won awards. You've got Cinque, I know you have several films that are in the Smithsonian. What are you both working on right now?
I just finished directing a short documentary for HBO Max in a new series called Through Our Eyes, and my film is called Uprooted, and it's on families who live in the United States and are at risk of losing their homes because of climate change.
Oh, wow.
And I just finished directing a short. We're looking for a distributor now. Actually, we're just finishing directing, but it's about a poet activist around mass incarceration that goes into Angola to do a one-woman show and gets shut down, and the kind of telling of the events that day and the movement that resulted from it.
Excellent. And Julie and Betsy, like I said, you've got 2 really wonderful films that are out right now, but what's next for the 2 of you?
We have been shooting and editing and are close to completing a film about another incredible, groundbreaking person, a woman who is living. So it's much more of a verite film. We can't say just yet who she is, but we're very excited about the film. Looking forward to completing it.
Excellent. Well, My Name is Pauli Murray is currently streaming on Amazon Prime. We were presuming that everybody watching this has seen it. Tell your friends, and if you haven't seen it, for heaven's sake, make it top of your queue, because this is an extraordinary piece of work about a legendary American who is far too little known among other Americans. So thank you all for your time today, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alonso.